Oh, hopefully it won't kill this computer. This is a very old one. All right, got all my bookmarks. Sweet. Okay, great. Okay, so share my screen. Do the normal thing that we do here, and we will go to the buoys first. So we have ye old opposite swell reading, 4.3 feet at 5 seconds from the west northwest. So, I mean, that's not a significant swell for anywhere. Like you're not, yeah, even if it was from a favorable direction, if it was from a favorable direction, yeah, you'd go to the beach and check it. But it's clearly the buoy is reading swell that's going out to sea. So we'll see what this one is up to. This has a weird, this one of those weird readings, 6.2 feet, 0.7 seconds, the actual swell height, 12.1 seconds from the south. So it's showing something kind of long period from the south, which is not enough to break, even though the significant wave height is really high. And that significant wave height has nothing to do with this longer period south swell, because if we look down, we see that the wind wave height is 6.2 feet at 5.9 seconds from the west. So that's that same winds going out to sea. And then when we take a look over at Windfinder and try to make sense of what the buoy is saying, we see precisely what it is talking about. I'm not sure what that long period south is, but we have just all of this west northwest flow off the continent, which is again super normal for this time of year. It should have been happening all month. That it hasn't kicked in till this late is why we've had so much surf recently. And so that's what the buoy is reading. It's reading the swell that's it's not really sending swell to anywhere, the middle of the Atlantic, really. Although, let's see, Portugal would be getting, it's kind of connected to this other system here, but they don't have anything like really organized in the way of surf over in Europe, but just local wind swell. They would have some waves, just nothing super significant or organized. Then when we we'll just do the 24-hour forecasts and look in here. And yeah, we have the energy flowing off the coast again. Saturday, it's still the same. So this is why it's going to be, the surf reports aren't wrong, saying that it's going to be flat. And there is a lot of, like this stuff down here, like if you were going to do like a surgical strike right now, it looks like there would be waves like in Barbados and DR and Puerto Rico. There's enough of this energy to like make waves for this area. And then pretty sure the West Coast has some swells. Yeah, you have this northwest swell here over in California, which would get to Hawaii as well. I'm sure nobody here is going to be surfing Hawaii in the middle of winter, especially when the WSL is there right now. And then moving towards Sunday, yeah, you have all of this energy down here. So again, like Barbados, Jamaica, the DR, Puerto Rico could get some energy from that. We are still experiencing some offshore flow, but there's enough down starting to come off the coast of the Carolinas that we could maybe start to see, you want it and then and then it's destroyed. Monday, that normal pattern again that we see this time of year where the cold air comes off of the Arctic down over Canada and the continental US and comes off of our coast at the beginning of the winter. Then you see this huge storm forming in the Atlantic here. Not sure what that does for like Nova Scotia surf. Maybe there's waves up there. And yeah, waves for Portugal and France. not so much for us, going the wrong direction. That's Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Then Wednesday before Thanksgiving, it chills out how we have this big kind of storm going to Florida that might start to give us something. Thanksgiving, here that storm formation gets a little bigger and starts to come into our window. And yeah, it looks like, and this was always forecasted, that we might get some waves the day after Thanksgiving. So looks like pretty much, barring any really huge change for us, a week of flatness. And then that is a huge swell that forms, that takes base. That's huge. So Nazare should probably break again, and super tubes, and depending on the winds, some sure breaks in France and Ireland, and Cornwall should have waves off of this swell. Probably Morocco, definitely Morocco as well would have waves from there. And then this energy actually kind of weakens down here, but still a little bit more for them, and then they would get north swell off of this. That's interesting, storm in the middle of the United States, and then you have these multiple systems over, so the West Coast is a good bet right now. More Northern California probably than Southern California, unless you wanted small waves. San Diego is like a place where I go in November when I'm trying to escape the flatness and the coldness here. Not uncommon for me to take a quick trip to California sometimes this time of year, for this very reason. So this is totally normal. And we've had a way above average November so far. And yeah, if we get waves in a week, as long as the flat spells aren't like over 2 weeks, that's good. 1 week is pretty brutal, but it looks like we're in for a 1 week flat spell. And we can just double check and see how we can just look at Windfinder, or not Windfinder, sorry, the local wind forecast. Get in touch with the local winds, wind advisory. Yeah, the wind advisory going the wrong way. Okay, so the hourly, just the Queens weather station. So 12 miles an hour from the west. And yeah, that's all day tomorrow. West winds, west southwest, gross. Those are offshore and clean in New Jersey, but just gonna be super flat down there. Saturday, more west winds and cold temps. More west winds, even harder. For Sunday, more west winds. For Monday, Tuesday, more west winds. Wednesday, a little west north, little north, west northwest in there. Then Thanksgiving, we have potential for snow, looks like. And then the favorable north winds for surfing in New York. So, keep an eye on whether that south swell develops. And then snow, this does really bode well for waves the day after Thanksgiving. Usually when we have weather, we have waves. Pretty common for us for those two things to coincide. And then these are favorable winds for surfing New York. Hard, but not too hard. And if this holds, potentially, yeah, the Thanksgiving weekend got to keep paying attention. And we will see how we did compared to Surfline, which I'm totally signed out of on this computer. I had a thing called Rockaways. Yeah, so far, flat, 0. Thanksgiving. So they have a pretty, they have like that being a real nor'easter the Saturday after Thanksgiving, which I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. That'd be pretty cool. And so that weekend, the 26th and 27th could have something. Any questions about the forecast?
Dion, that first buoy 91.
Yes.
I'm really curious about, when we see this significant wave height at 5 or 6, and then the
Well, this one doesn't have that reading. 44091 doesn't.
oh, maybe it was 25 we were looking at.
Yeah, it's 44025 that has that.
It's like one's 6 feet and one's
Mhm.
less than 1 foot. What does that mean?
Okay, so you have to look at the other data to see, and you have to compare it with 44091. So the swell that it's reading is 0.7 feet at 12 seconds from the south. That's the swell that it's reading. The significant wave height is the highest wave that hits it. That wave has nothing to do with this tiny, tiny south swell that no way on earth could get past. That 6.2 feet is associated here with the wind wave height, which is 6.2 feet at 5.9 seconds from the west. So this larger reading is associated with the wind wave, and the wind is going the wrong direction.
I see.
So this tiny little swell from the south has to compete with these huge wind waves coming from the west, which there's just no way on earth that it can win. And if we go to 44091 and see 4.3 feet at 5 from the west northwest, we see that that is a similar reading to that 6 point whatever at 5 from the west that 44025 has. So this is effectively reading the same swell or wind waves that are created as 44025. So when you see two of the buoys have readings that are correlated, that's going to be like the dominant energy in the water. When you see a strong correlation like that. So for example, yesterday, like I wrote on Instagram, very weird day, 44025. Well, when I woke up in the morning, 44091 was 7 at 7 from the east northeast, which was like, whoa, way, like already way bigger system, but east northeast is a very steep angle. So, and 7 seconds is not a high interval, but it's still like cancelable for somebody who's a complete beginner, for example, or somebody who's like got a weaker paddling. So potentially bigger. I went to the beach and it was way bigger than I thought it was going to be, but the angle was really steep and the waves weren't like massive. It still would have been hard for it was hard for Monica, who's like moving into the intermediate range. She got scared of taking off on a bunch of waves. And then the other thing that was happening was that 44025, which has those multiple readings, like you noticed, the readings on that one were 0 feet at 12 seconds, and the significant wave height was 10 feet. But that was all from the east. So that wind wave was from the local storm that hit us. Remember, it was raining the day before yesterday, all through the night into the morning. And that wind was coming from the east. So that high wave height was coming from wind that was pointed at us, not out to sea. So that 10-foot raw swell later in the day around 10:30 in the morning organized into a more solid but smaller reading, 5-6 feet at 8 seconds from the southeast. As the storm moved down from the northeast, it became a southeast swell, which is favorable for us, and the waves were overhead and just pumping. Like it was totally wild. I mean, I canceled with Fialka because I knew it was too big in the morning. Monica had a struggling first session. It was kind of bigger first thing in the morning. Then my second session of people whose work times are in California, my 8 to 9:30 people had like the best conditions of the day because it was light offshore winds and only like 3 feet, like 2 feet smaller. I thought it was going to go flat already because the wind was coming up from the west northwest. So I already thought the swell was going to go away. Their session, their 90 minutes was done in like perfect beginner conditions. They had a great time. They go off on their merry way. And then my 10 a.m.s come, who are intermediates, who I was going to film from the beach. And then the waves were like 6 foot and they both really struggled. Soyup only got one wave and Deb didn't get any waves. And it just pumped for the rest of the afternoon, and then the wind came hard from the west northwest. And I was checking the buoy all day and just watched that swell direction change on the buoy. Because I had considered going to New Jersey if the swell direction was going to stay very east and the wind was going to stay very west, because New Jersey's, bigger on an east swell and those winds are favorable. But Rockaway was like good enough, more than good enough to stay. And now, then those winds just picked up out of the west throughout the late afternoon and evening and cross chopped up the waves. And there was still like a fun wave to be had at dark yesterday. I almost surfed, but I was too tired. And yeah, I also canceled a 3 p.m. session with a new to me student, and I'm not sure how good she is at surfing because I'm still traumatized after what I saw on Sunday
Yeah.
in those winds. I just didn't like I was a little bummed when I saw it in the evening. I was like, oh, it could have been good for a lesson, but it was still windy and hard. And yeah, just after seeing that, and that the fact that there was a surf instructor involved in the accident, I just like wanted to be extra cautious. So I canceled that session. Yeah,
Sunday was insane. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Did
Sunday
you
was
see
insane.
it, Emma? As well?
No,
I think I was out there at about the same time, but I was at like 90. I was in a different spot. It was just like really weird and chaotic.
yeah, people were frothing so hard, and that's just something that really happens after a large swell event. Everybody is intimidated, as they should be, by the size of the waves that Hurricane Nicole produced. So literally everybody and their mom is like, I'm going on
next day.
Sunday.
The
I'm
next
going
day,
on
yeah.
Sunday.
Yeah.
Like Sunday's my day. It's the day that I get to go, because like it's going to be too big Saturday. And the energy starting first thing in the morning was off.
Hmm.
Although I will say, yeah, I was grumpy because I surfed. Well, I got really good waves in New Jersey, but I would have done my whole day differently, hindsight. On the other hand, I got a lot of footage of me surfing backside, which is going to be great for the newsletters because so many people are regular foot surfing in New York, and I have so little footage for the instructional videos of me surfing backside. And so many people need help with backside techniques. So in a way, it was great that I surfed New Jersey all day, but I was exhausted. The current was really hard down there. And so I just woke up a little bit grumpy because I knew everybody was frothing, and then Rockaway just had its like crazy energy. And I went out with Brant and Bryce, and it was freezing cold too, and just didn't wear enough wetsuit because I've made some questionable calls, I think I would say, based upon my tiredness. And so Bryce is very intermediate, he's like doing cutbacks and stuff like that. And it was his last session in his package. And I went home and I took a bath. And my intuition too, I didn't go with my intuition 2 days in a row. But my intuition going to bed on Saturday night was to surf in Long Beach instead of Rockaway on Sunday. And we did Rockaway. And I went home, I took an Epsom salt bath, and I got like recharged. And Bryce lives in Long Island, so I was like, text me pictures of Long Beach. And he did, and it looked really good. And I was like, I'm gonna come there and film you. And I went to Long Beach with MG and Bryce. And Bryce was already there. MG came, and they surfed, and I filmed them, and they had an awesome session. And like there was like barely anybody out, and the waves were soft and great for all levels. So that was. And then I went back to Rockaway. I had pushed my more beginnery people towards the afternoon because the wind report said it was going to be northwest all day. I was like, oh, sweet, I'll coach all day Sunday because it's going to be offshore all day. But the wind got really hard out of the west northwest, and that tide got super low, and the froth energy didn't go away. It was at 1:30 p.m. when we were checking the surf, like it was crowded and bad and closed out and like dangerous looking, and there was that glare. So that's why we all walked to the shoreline just to see if we could get a better. I mean, I didn't want to coach, but educationally we went down to the shoreline to like get a better look at it. And that's when we witnessed the surf accident, basically happened right in front of us. And yeah, and the guy's and it was, like I've said on Instagram, and it was 3 people, including a surf instructor, in the middle of the other 2 guys that all ran into each other at once on a closeout. And so seeing that guy's face and just what can happen in the froth of everybody like trying to make the most of that smaller day or the smaller waves. Like small waves are really dangerous. It's actually where most people get hurt on the small. I mean, I'm gonna stop the share now. Like small waves is the worst surf injuries happen in small waves for sure.
Mm.
Way more than larger surf, especially small, shallow waves. Shallow and small is really.
I feel like it's been so shallow lately.
Been
Like
yeah.
I nearly broke my toe 3 weeks ago. It's still like I still can't like walk or run or pop up. It's not broken, but it was like very injured. And it's just like I was literally laying on the board, I caught the wave and I looked and it was like closing out. And so I just went to like roll off the back of it instead. And like the ground was right there, just like smashed my foot on the ground. It wasn't even jumping off the board. I was just trying to gently like roll off the back of it. And now I'm like, I can like not even walk properly.
Yeah, it's been really, they dumped a lot of sand.
Yeah.
They really dumped a lot of sand. So at those low tides, it's really, really shallow.
Yeah.
And it's the case at all the beaches, that was like part of the project. That's part of the restoration project. It doesn't seem like I think did anybody read the Surfrider NYC post recently?
Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it's gonna take 3 years.
To build the dune.
Yeah.
It might be done pumping I think the sand pumping
Yeah.
they said was done, going to be done this.
Yeah.
I don't see the platforms out there anymore.
It was gone, and then I noticed it was back a few days ago in a different spot. And I went for a walk
Out in the
on
sea?
Tuesday. Yeah, I went for a walk on Tuesday night. It was like 8 p.m. and they were actively pumping it up at 86.
Okay, but they're supposed to, I think the Surfrider post said that they were going to be done by December 2022 with the sand
Okay.
pumping.
Mm.
And
Yeah, I talked to one of those Army Corps guys, and he said they were gonna, that once all the sand was pumped, and they were pushing it up to get it in place, and then they were gonna, it looks like they've built the dune, right? But then they're gonna tear it apart and keep putting in those sheet pilings and the rock, and then cover it back up with sand.
right.
So
I
it's
keep
very,
thinking,
very involved.
like
I'm
they
gonna try to
moved.
go, I'm gonna try to get press access and get some interviews with those guys,
Oh,
some
cool.
formal interviews to find out more.
Okay, cool. Good.
I keep thinking like, should they have moved it all at once? Like, there's gonna be a big storm and we're just gonna lose all the sand. Like how it's all just sitting there in piles for months.
Yeah, their logic is bad. They
Like I already can see it. The hills have gotten so much shorter just from like the wind blowing the sand away.
I mean, the stick that they tried to cover over, so they did rip out. I was like looking at old footage to be like, wait, did they bury it or did they rip it out, the pole at 60th? And they did try to rip it out. That's why it's all mangled. It never was mangled like that before. But already it's like now 4 feet where it was
Right.
like 2 feet. So it's like a pretty good measurement for how much of the beach has already eroded. But from my perspective, the reason why they do these projects in winter, which is so dumb, is
Yeah.
because they should be doing it in summer. Look,
Yeah.
they would, the sand doesn't move in the summer, but
Yeah.
because of the whole summer season thing, but
Yeah.
they would make a more lasting, the project would go faster.
Yeah.
They have longer days of
Yeah.
sunlight.
Well, they're working in the dark.
they wouldn't have to.
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
just feel like a big
They could do it
nor'easter is
faster
gonna
and more
wash it away.
effectively in
Yeah.
July and August.
Yeah.
And the reason why they don't is that's the middle of the summer season and they don't want to like ruin the beaches for everybody.
Yeah.
But doing these projects during the highest swell time of the year is really stupid.
Yeah.
And you know, I think they have like a rock and a hard place, literally,
Yeah.
rock and a soft place decision about this thing with the season.
Yeah.
Like, and
Right.
goers using the nice weather to be on the beaches. So the reason why they do it this time of year is, you know,
Well, they tried to do it in the summer, right? And then there was an outcry.
Oh,
I
is that
think
what
that
they
tried.
were doing?
There
I
was
thought
this
that was just
announcement that,
I thought that was just the jetty construction, no?
I mean, I remember this, I don't remember the details. Maybe it was
Okay.
just jetty construction, but
Mm.
I remember the outcry over closing of the beach in the summer. And then
Yeah.
they
Yeah, for
compromised.
the impact on the boardwalk businesses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's that whole socioeconomic thing going on there with so that's why that's why they do it this time. I mean, like I said
Yeah.
in previous calls, I watched this a very similar construction project happen in Long Beach. And yeah, I watched all their work basically go away in 3
Pretty
weeks.
quickly.
You know, they like the ocean this time of year is just too, even though it goes flat for like, you know, they'll get a lot of work done this week. Thanksgiving, who knows if they'll take a break.
But then,
Maybe they'll
yeah,
do it over time.
I can just think of so many times when like at high tide, it's gone all the way up to the edge of the boardwalk, basically. Like
I mean, it's
like
going
last
up at
winter when that
62nd,
buoy washed
the
up.
way at 62nd, the way that they built the beach, the tide is now going more to the dunes than it ever did before.
Oh,
I've
interesting.
never
Yeah.
seen the tide go up as high to the dunes as it is
Because
right
it's like
now.
flat or smoother, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've
That
never
buoy at 69 last year that washed up right at the back of the beach, like right next to the
Yeah.
boardwalk. So like you know how high the water's going.
Yeah, I mean, I do see why, and I've written about that, why they have to try something.
Yeah.
But they are constrained. They're having to make like a bunch of difficult, you know, political decisions. There is politics in all of this, and different people's wills and different people's ideas of, you know, what the beach is for and who should have access to the beach and like at what times of year are most important to do these kind of projects. And there's all you know, the 30s is crazy. I don't know what they're doing with the 38th Street jetty, because it was gone, but I guess now they'll rebuild it. I assume. I haven't been down recently, but I did make that. I did put a little picture of Kristen Shea, who's an artist. She like put one of her art projects in the 30s, which once they like develop it will be gone. It's worth going down there and like seeing. It's interesting too, like the story of like that shape is from a surf spot on Lake Michigan, where she's from in Detroit, like in Michigan. Yeah, like she took like all of these industrial scenes from the surf spot where she learned to surf in the Great Lakes and like reduplicated them in a studio. And she's then her studio work, she like put part of her, literally dumped her art project in the 30s, which is also a funny comment on like how other people use the 30s as well as a dumping site.
Yeah.
Do you know which block it's on?
It's on Sprayview, the dirt road. It's
Okay.
it's in between 36 and 38 off of
Cool.
Sprayview. The road that you turn the wrong way to get to the parking at 38 for now. Yeah, and it's cool. I saw it in her MFA show at Columbia, so I have this, you know, more of a context when I look at it, but it looks cool there. And yeah, it's kind of, I guess, a cool like little urban legend thing now that's very small. But anyway,
If you know, you know.
if you know, you know. It is cool though that like Great Lakes surfing is like connected to Rockaway surfing a little bit in this way there. And it looks like, you know, she went on this retreat to Costa Rica in late September, early October, and I got to learn a little bit more about surfing the Great Lakes and what they have a really like it seems they have a really positive surf community on the Great Lakes. I started following some of the surf shops there, and I think because there are so few swells, and also not that Midwestern people aren't also full of resentment and hatred like the rest of us, but Sophia, my partner, Derek, that everybody else here knows of her, but her family's from Minneapolis, and we like coined this term Midwestern nice, where like sometimes there's the like anger and resentment like hiding behind the Midwestern nice, but they're just, oh, don't you know, they're so nice. And it seems that the Great Lakes like surf community has that, you know, and some of it's really genuine Midwestern nice. Yeah, they seem like a very welcoming surf community. Like you could email them and be like, I'm gonna come surf this swell there. Can you like, I don't know. That's at least the perception, is that oceanic kind of localism doesn't seem as bad in the Great Lakes. They seem like a very welcoming, cool community of surfers. And looks like
The surf shop in Toronto is really cool. You should follow them if you haven't. Surf the Greats.
okay.
I've actually gotten a lot of my stuff from them shipped to
Okay.
New York. And they send out emails to anyone that's done their intro to flat water when they're surf. So like they're tentatively booking people for like 12 to 2 on Saturday this week, for
Yeah,
example.
so actually to make that a point with the surf forecast, when we see those cold air sheets coming down off the Arctic, these things that don't provide us surf, they do make surf in the Great Lakes. So you can't in the Great, like these storms that we can't surf do make waves in the Great Lakes. That's a time, you know, and they do surf in the winters a lot because that's when the big storms come down, like down off the Arctic and off the East Coast United States. All right. That usually we spend about 30 to 40 minutes on surf forecasting. So that part's done. And now we'll go to book 5, which like you would think that book 5 was the way that book 4 ends. You would think that you would get right into the different kinds of government, which is going to happen in the later books. The difference between, well, it's really, depending on how you look at it, 6 or 7 forms of government, not 3, because there is the ideal form of each and the less ideal form of each kind of government. And then the most ideal form is the one that is actually started to be developed at the end of book 5, which is the one that has a philosopher king or ruler. So, but book 5 is pretty interesting. I called it in my notes Socrates' pre-K program. Universal pre-K for Guardians. Which he does have, basically, actually, in this model of the Just City, there is universal pre-K for the Guardian class, which involves young children riding to war on very swift horses.
Yeah, only the swiftest horses.
Swiftest horses.
This book was so wild. I was like, at several times, I was like, is he joking? Like, I was really trying to figure out how real he intended it, Socrates. You know, I was
well,
like,
he keeps saying it's so paradoxical that it could, you know, it could never come to be. It's like, forgive me for saying something so absurd.
I definitely,
so it's a good question.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, this is just further validating he's building a dystopia.
Oh, right, Plato the sci-fi writer.
Yeah.
Is it a utopia or is it a dystopia?
And then I got really caught up on the, well, then it's sort of explained, but the logistics of how you'll know who your kids and your grandkids are. So it's like, you should make sure that you only ever hook up with someone in the same month so that you only have to rule out later hooking up with people who are born in 1 month instead of all the months, because then who will be left? Like it's like this insane system.
Yeah, there is a lot in this book for sure. And I think the concept of anti-logistikon, which is contradiction, and aporia, and like at what, because we've been puzzling through the first 4 books with all of these contradictions and logical contradictions that come up. And that's something that can be seen in a very serious philosophical light, like it gets to in the end of this book of like, how do we know, that's where I ended up thinking at, how do we know what the truth from falsehood? How do you know friend is a friend? How do you know an enemy is an enemy? How do you, like, there's the concept of a thing in itself or a quality in itself, and the very conditions for the possibility of knowledge qua knowledge, that you like can have certainty that a thing is a thing. And a person who loves wisdom is a person who cares to ask these questions and figure out what the difference between being and appearing is, if there is a difference, or what the relationship between being and appearing is. And then also all of these things about relative values and conservative versus liberal values, meaning the things which get their strength from never changing, or the things, or whether, or to what extent we need to like change our categories to like suit better normative system that is going to provide a more just society. Because what comes in this book is actually a much more liberal, like it's like some books are more conservative and some are more liberal than others, where you have in one book him talking about how we need these deeply conservative principles because the strongest thing is that which withstands change. And then here, when he's talking about how women guardians ought to be treated, he's like, well, clearly, like there was a point we can remember when exercising naked, which gymnadsto, the verb in Greek, really means to work out naked, where it's, you basically, everybody laughed at people's genitals when people started working out naked, and then they realized, oh, you know what, it's not that big of a deal, and actually it's better to do the sports naked because you have more flexibility. You're not like constrained by the hemation, the like big cloaks that they would wear, because their clothing wasn't very good for athletic stuff. So they didn't have athleisure clothing yet. They just had to take off all the robes. And so they like provided an example here of actually a case where norms changed and people got used to it, and it was for the better. So when they're talking about the possibility of women having more equal rights, because they like come up on this hard sexual difference of women being weaker than men, but still for the time, the amount of equality that's the Socrates character is willing to afford women, and actually the faith that he has that some women, just like some men, because I made the point last time too, that in this kind of feminism, not all men are awesome because they're men, right? Socrates is not a masculinist or in that way. There are better and worse men. And unfortunately, the worst of the worst men are no better than women, and the worst women and children. But he definitely and clearly says here that like there are women that are better at doing stuff than some men. And there are some women stronger than other women. And those women should be, we would say, the strongest in a certain way. Those that can know themselves the most and have the most self-discipline should be in the guardian class. And there should be a eugenic program. There should be some type of Bene Gesserit order with a breeding program. That's like, I can not stop thinking of Dune still. And I mean, I think Frank Herbert must have read, everybody's read The Republic. So, I mean, he clearly read The Republic, but to make like an ideal society, this idea that you would have basically stock books, breeding program books for humans is, well, it's an idea that's in this book. And it's an idea that comes out in Dune as well, where that is one of the main things that the Bene Gesserit order does, is they oversee a intergalactic, generations upon generations long breeding program to ensure that the people that stay in this order, which is basically like the guardian class, maintain their powerful lineage. And it's clearly, you know, if you're sensitive, it's clearly like a very ableist breeding program as well, because it does pretty much suggest that anybody that is born disabled probably dies by exposure, like you scuttle them off into the woods and let the buzzards at them. Which, you know, if we did that, there would be no Stephen Hawking. So that's clearly a bad idea. And that's something also we've been like, that's, there's a playful way in which we're like continually talking about how you find the good and how you know that somebody belongs in this class or a thing belongs in this category, and how the categories are going to hold, and really the nature of truth, which I think that, me personally, I think that Heidegger does a really good job on his hermeneutics of aletheia, which is the word for truth that is used here. So some of the like important Greek words that they call into question in this book are aletheia, which is truth, doxa, which is opinion or belief, where we get the word orthodoxy, and orthos, which is correctness. So they're asking after how we determine that a thing is aletheia, the truth, versus opinion, doxa, and what a correct way of doing anything is. So what the orthos way of doing something is. And how you determine something is orthos is being able to know the difference between aletheia and doxa. And aletheia comes from alethos, so uncovered, right? And Heidegger does all of this work on this idea of this concept that comes from Greek of truth as that which is the most bare, that which is completely uncovered and stripped, the essence, the essential truth, and whether there is a possibility of ever getting down to that, right? Which will be in the history of philosophy, the very purpose of phenomenology is to show the way in which things are interconnected and interrelated. So when you do the uncovering work through the logos, you're not recovering an essence, but you are showing things in their fullness. You're allowing them to shine through in the ways that they're interconnected with everything else. And so the project is not so much like well, you know, there's different kinds of phenomenologies. So there's the Husserlian reduction, the epoche, where you basically bracket the natural attitude in order to pick things apart and then put them back together again, and then show truth in this like larger, fuller manner. But the possibility of doing that bracketing is something that will be called into question by the later phenomenological tradition. But Husserl's gesture that, you know, we need to do something like look at the conditions for the possibility of experience and how we articulate experiences, so that something like, because he's talking from, like, you know, it's that book, The Crisis of, what is Husserl's crisis book called? Crisis of the European Sciences or something like that.
I think that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Because the crisis is still this crisis that's here in the Republic, which is, how do we ground truth? How do we ground the truth claims? How does like one term hold enough that enough of us can agree that this term is in its right category, and that we agree that what constitutes knowledge, episteme, which is where we get science, is going to be that this is as certain as we get for a term. Because if we're going to build structures, we need things to hold enough so that the structures hold. And we have been able to do that. We do make airplanes and bridges, and it hasn't worked so well for politics so far. Much better for airplanes. But we have not, we're still figuring out political structures. And that's, again, we've talked about this a lot throughout reading The Republic, which is that the project that is involved in this dialogue that was written so long ago is a completely still open problem for humans, and explored in a very interesting manner, which is hard to tell whether it's playful or serious at points. It's really hard to tell when like somebody's just taking the piss here, or when they're proposing like a real political solution, I think. I mean, I don't
But also the vibe is that the most radical part is about like the forms.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the part where he's like, well, this is really crazy though.
Well, because the forms are going to be the way that you get to aletheia, right? It's complete uncoveredness. Seeing things as they are, not just the shadows on the wall. But then you need to know about the light source. And I mean, we'll get to that discussion. We'll get to the cave, right? It's coming up soon. It's obviously not in the first 5 books, but if I remember correctly, the problem is once you go out, like there's no way to communicate the forms to the masses. So the philosopher king, right? Like basically the foreshadowing in book 5 is like the only way to have a just society is for the rulers to be philosophers. And that is actually touching on a larger issue throughout the Platonic dialogues, is how do you distinguish a philosopher from a sophist?
Which gets into the whole question of being and not being.
Which is here. This is like, you're just like, if
All right.
you know your ancient philosophy, this whole last section of book 5 is like Parmenides, Parmenides, Parmenides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wait, can you elaborate on that for those of us who don't have the reference?
Parmenides argued. Parmenides wrote an epic he wrote it in the epic style, a poem arguing that only being is, that only being is, nothing is not, there's no such thing as motion, everything is still, there's only one substance.
Or, in the words of one of my favorite movies of all time, nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. So somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. I know all of the words to Sound of Music. But it actually goes to the larger history of asking about how it is that things are in the tradition of ancient philosophy. The way that it's taught in a Western academic tradition goes like this really quickly. Thales of Miletus, number 1, the pre-Socratic philosophers, Thales says everything is water. So everything is something for Thales, and that everything is water. And then Anaximenes is like, no, it can't be water. There's something smaller than water, right? It's air. and it's processes of rarefaction and condensation, which like always when I teach the oceanography class, like he's not wrong, right? Like heating and cooling processes, thermodynamics, all of these different early philosophers are on to some really essential principle about how the world works, which they're getting just from empirical observation. And so this is why they say philosophy begins in ancient Greece, science, this kind of Western science begins, because they're not trying to explain the seasons by, you know, Zeus moved the sun over here. They're like, no, precipitation, condensation, the waters are moving in this way, shape, or form, right? And then you get Anaximander, who Carlo Rovelli, the quantum physicist, has written a whole book about, which is fucking awesome, and we've read for a book club. We read Carlo Rovelli. We read Carlo Rovelli, but we didn't read Anaximander. I read Anaximander, but he wrote a book on Anaximander, and it's awesome. And Anaximander still, and I agree with Rovelli, the most important, no, they're all important, but one of the most important pre-Socratic philosophers, he posits this thing called to aperon, the unbounded. And so he puts this principle of infinity or eternity in there. And for Anaximander, everything comes from this unbounded, unlimited stuff. That's where everything comes from. So something comes from to aperon, the unbounded, and it goes back to aperon. And the way that it operates in its begetting and living and dying and returning back to aperon is put in a political language of paying justice back and forth. So there's the Anaximander fragment, which Heidegger also has an essay on in his early Greek thinking text. And I always remember it's Tissus. I'm forgetting the actual Greek of the Anaximander fragment, but the sense of it is that like summer and winter, for example, are paying, justice is meted out in that winter gets to reign for its time and summer gets to reign for its time. And so they're given their due, right? That language that we see in the beginning of the Republic. Winter gives summer its due and summer gives winter its due. And in spring and in fall, you know, there are different give and takes that happen in the transition between the warmer and the cooler months. And so this concept of to aperon is like this huge conceptual leap where he's making sense not only of the seasons and the condensation and the rarefaction and the waters existing and the other elements, but also that there's something, that there is an unknown, indescribable, from which they come from. And so you have this principle of something that could be called a nothing, right? Something greater, something that we know not of, but that exists from which everything comes. Then you have Heraclitus, who says that the only thing that there is change. You can't step in the same river twice. And he posits now this time an eternal fire. So you have just another elemental switch. Then you have Parmenides come along in this tradition, and it's not exactly chronological, but Parmenides is basically putting his stake down and being like, you can't have, something must come from something. It all has to trace back to a thing that exists. So there's no void. There's no vacuum. And so it's a positivism. So in a way, like Parmenides can be seen as the father of logical positivism. the great grandfather, and he has this epic poem, and the way that the way that he shows his proof is, you know, in not written in the way the other early philosophers write, but he makes a point that like everybody has to come back to because of the law of contradiction. So you have to return to this. So you'll whenever you're faced with this question, about nothing versus something and something. And, you know, now with antimatter, like the nothing is a something. So you have to start thinking about your assumptions about what nothing is. Is it blackness, darkness? Something beyond what like our human capacities can contemplate? Yeah, there are like nothing studies now. I think Heidegger was the one that said the nothing nuts. But yeah, this is a huge, I mean, this is a huge, this also again remains a huge question. Like, for example, it splits people on what they think about the Big Bang. So there are people who believe that time began with the Big Bang. But what was before the Big Bang? Where did the little particles that came together at that time come from? I'm an eternalist. I believe there's something before the Big Bang. But I'm totally okay with saying the Big Bang started our universe and galaxy, and fine. I think you could have both. I don't, you know, but I don't know. I don't know if for me it's worth proving that, like, well, this is where Spinoza helps you get out of this problem. Because if it's God or nature and it wouldn't be infinite if you knew everything about it, it kind of lets you off the hook where you can like be small and, you know, not all knowing. And that's part of a thing that you know. So like part of your search for truth is like pushing yourself to the limits of your of what you can know. And to constantly to do the philosophical thing. And I think maybe this is also in Socratic spirit as well. Because we had the thing from book 4, right? The what was the Takalepa Kala, which is basically that same Spinozistic aphorism. Kalepa Takala, fine things are difficult. So if you're in pursuit of truth, that's always going to be difficult. It's the finest thing to do, and it's going to be the most difficult thing to do, because again, I think I said this last time, in the modern language of like Bayesian statistics, it would mean constantly updating your priors. It would mean constantly taking stock of where your truth claims, how you're basing your truth claims, instead of like coming down to like a moral authoritarianism. And I think that's kind of the point that I was like trying to drive at in the newsletter last time, when I'm like, the conservative principle should be about the faculty that does that priors updating, not about keeping the priors constant, but about keeping the faculty that updates its priors sharp, and conserving it and saving it and working it out and keeping it strong, and not altering it in the sense that like weakening it. You want to continue to strengthen that faculty. And barring dementia, I mean, I do think that I agree also with this text that like doing exercise actually does help. I think blood flow probably helps your reasoning faculty work as well. I don't see why it wouldn't. So I wouldn't want to say that it's like purely intellectual in a way that is divorced from, you know, physical activity either. Because if it's really doing reflecting, it would reflect in self-knowledge that like movement's good for the body. And so,
and balancing opens up neuroplasticity. So if you're like having a precarious relationship with gravity in some way, but even if it's still safely, it opens up neuroplasticity for anything, including knowledge.
what are the studies? What are those studies? Who did those?
I could not list it off the top of my head, but can send you.
What were you reading? What were you reading? That
The Huberman Labs podcast did a series on neuroplasticity. And yeah, it's like super, super interesting. But there's like, so you're basically, because we can hear something and see something and like understand at the same time, like all of those things line up in our brains. They're all very intricately connected, and that enables us to use like physical cues to open up neuroplasticity.
Cool.
Because of the way that all the systems line up. So if you were like, felt like you were going to fall, like maybe surfing, your body has this cue that like, oh, we need to learn something. This is a dangerous situation. We need to learn something. And it like opens up this pathway for neuroplasticity. But then once the pathway is open, you can use it for anything.
One of the first philosophers of neuroplasticity was William James, the great American pragmatist. He was talking about brain plasticity in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was a little, I think I've talked about this before at some other point, but he was a little cynical about, like he said, after 33, none of your habits can change, which is just totally wrong. He's like, you're pretty much, your character is set 33, like maybe your character, but I would have to go read more William James to see, but I remember that sticking in my head when he was like pretty hardcore about 33 years old being the age when like it's done, like get the
So
habit.
specific.
Yeah, get your brain, get your well, I mean, I think his point is that like our plasticity becomes more rigid after our midlife, you know, which is not technically wrong, but I would push the number way higher. And then I don't even know, maybe I would go as far as saying he's wrong. There's a point at which we degenerate, I guess, but like, I don't think Spinoza, I don't think we know what bodies can do still. I don't think we know what bodies are capable of. How long, like with more, we're learning so much, like this Huberman's podcast is all about asking the question of what bodies can do.
Well, and one of the things he talks about is like, we don't know how much neuroplasticity we can unlock as adults. We know that it's like happens in smaller increments than as kids, but like, and we know that if someone put like a gun to your head and said, learn French in 2 minutes, like you couldn't do that, but we don't know really what the limit is.
Yeah. I mean, and clearly this is the idea of like, of shaping, right? Of self-shaping, self-fashioning. The word, it's funny to read this text because I wrote a paper for a class in graduate school that was all about the relationship between the ascetic and the athletic, and the relationship between an athlete and like a religious ascetic practice. And in the Greek, the word for working out is ascesis. It is the word where we get asceticism. So asceticism is just a set of disciplinary practices. And in the Greek language, especially in the Platonic dialogues, it's very closely aligned to all of this working out talk, all of this talk about like, you know, gymnastics, for lack of. I mean, also that word's in there, gymnasto. So that would be ascesis is the self-shape, right? And we think of ascetics. I was also working from the context of the Christian tradition where people were molding themselves in the image of the practices of Jesus, right? So instead of this thing, which I find annoying, you know, just accept, they wouldn't say just accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. Their thing was be Jesus. Like do ascetic practices. Like what did he do? Your body can do that too. Like he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. You can fast for 40 days and 40 nights. Or like do some crazy equivalent, like push your body to its extremes, because through like these practices, you get to experience different psychological states, right? And like chemically speaking, like when you push yourself to do endurance stuff, I'm going to keep it like loose and broad, endurance stuff, which like Plato's guardian class is clearly geared to. They're ascetics. The word ascesis is all over this. They're an ascetic class. It's just that his brand of asceticism includes sex and wine in moderation. You know, it's not the Christian kind where that's where the exemplarity is in the model building for like I've listened to the Huberman, you know, they're obsessed with this word protocols, obsessed.
Well, that's like a science
yeah
thing. Yeah.
But they're using it for like fitness.
Yeah.
Diet,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so like they
I feel like I use that word too a lot because I'm an analyst by day. So it's like, it's just the way my brain's always thinking.
I mean, the guardians have all these protocols.
Yeah.
You know, they have ways they're supposed to eat. They have ways they're supposed to work out, and the protocols, like this book starts off with like, what is the sexual difference protocol?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that this is also one of those things where like, you know, you guys have talked about like Glaucon being a little bit of a pushover, and there's certain points where he just like, okay, the women are, and they're like, okay, we agree women are weaker, but they're not so weak that they can't be part of the guard. You would need them in the like, Socrates. Plato is writing in the mouth of Socrates a very early kind of feminism where there would have to be some kind of equality between the sexes in order for there to be justice in the society, which is pretty fascinating. I actually am curious what you women thought of reading about this conversation of sexual difference was like.
I mean, at the start, when he's like talking about the dogs, I'm like, where is this going? Like, what is going on? But it's interesting how he's using like the animal kingdom to like justify this idea. Like he's like, see the animals, like they all go hunting, not just the men. So like, why shouldn't we? It is like an interesting approach to say like this is like a totally contrived world that we live in. It's not necessarily a natural.
I mean, I was kind of shocked. I didn't remember that from like my first time I read it. And I mean, there's stuff where like certain branches of the military didn't allow women in combat positions for like a really long time. And that's definitely not, I mean, I thought that was, so there was some, I mean, not to say, right, there's a lot of things about it that are not modern by any means. And I think he still thinks overall that women are just like, right, like the best guardian. I feel like they're like the better guardian is always going to be a man, right? Like, I feel like that's not.
Well,
people disagree.
I think it's debatable. I mean, I think it's debatable in the sense that I think the picture is a little more holistic where he's like, okay, so in order for the society to flourish, you need to have more good citizens than bad citizens. Right. And if you're going to have more citizens at all, there has to be procreation.
Right.
At least a sufficient amount of it and not too much of it, right? This has been a point since the beginning. You can't let the city get too big. You can't let people just like have babies willy-nilly, because then they're not going to be able to afford all of the babies and feed all of the mouths. And you can't have too few or the society will perish. So if you're going to have children, you're going to need women in the situation. And his point is that the guardian class, and so they're the exemplars, and like the society is going to flourish better if there are more exemplary people. So his point is that even if like it seems that like his big contention of sexual difference here is only that men are physically stronger than women. And that's like, and even then I think you could probably argue him into saying like, and he does as much say like there are also women who are physically stronger than men, but the most physically strong cisgendered biological man is going to be stronger than the most physically strong biological cisgendered woman. So like, you're not going to get her if like a part of the guardian task is to lift a rock that weighs X amount of kilos, like really heavy. You're gonna get the dude to do that job. So the division of labor there is going to be, you're not gonna get the strongest woman to do that job when there's a guy that's stronger than her to do that job. Again, this is very like sex essentialist. And there is a way though, in which like this Greek world society in which this text is being written, it was in a way like, even with these essentialist ideas about sexuality, as we all know, more fluid and open than society will become under Roman and Christian rule. So this is art like the Greeks were the Greeks had some things that some of that like hierarchy of being, you know, again, where it's like gods, men, women, children. The whole idea of barbarians and slaves that comes in to the picture here too is also problematic, you know, when they're talking about, well, of course, Greeks, like when they're talking about the difference between factions and enemies, right?
Yeah.
So the barbarians are enemies because they're non-Greeks, and Greeks like all have this Philhellenism of like, well, I love you because you're a Greek, but you have Greeks that war against other Greeks, and that's not in degree as strong as the hatred towards a barbarian. And a barbarian for the Greeks is just a non-Greek. And there are all different kinds of barbarians, but any non-Greek. But how do you like even, I mean, I don't even know how they were identifying Greeks as Greeks, right? Because Greece is like this, you know, there's all these little islands and stuff. It's, you know, they don't have the same kind of nationhood concepts statehood concepts that we're operating with. But at any rate,
I just had to speak Greek.
you just had to speak Greek. Yeah, I guess it was all in the language then.
I'm sure there was like a vibe component to it as well, like do you seem Greek?
Yeah, well, they would have known too for that. Also for the being a citizen of a certain city state. I mean, the political structures are like are pretty radically different.
Yeah.
But at
Sparta
any rate,
versus Athens.
back to the gender thing. I think there is a lot of nuance in it though, which is interesting. So for the breeding program to work, you have to have the smartest, best women with the smartest, best dudes, who are the best at guarding themselves, the best at knowing themselves. So you have basically, and also based upon that natural example of the animals that he's talking about, like he sees female wolves hunting and he knows that mares are good horses. Like you don't just, you know, in some cases, like there are qualities to a mare that is much better for being a horse than a stud or a stallion. So it's clear that whoever is, whether it's Plato or Socrates, but in the text, we do get at least something to have discourse about, right? Where it's not really clear, like the status of women is not like totally clear they're that women are inferior. It is, they do seem to like come down on, again, this gender or sex essentialist thing that the strongest guy is going to be stronger. But that doesn't necessarily mean like all the best guardian in terms of an example. I mean, I think that what he wants is male and female guardians, that there couldn't be this perfect Callipolis if the male and female guardians weren't both exemplary. Because that's the only way. It's not the only, but it's interesting, it's not the only way they're going to make exemplary children, because in the myth of the metals, he says that like gold children could come from any kind of
so this is what I kept thinking about. Are they making all of the kids for the city and then they're like, this kid is like got a producer vibe and this kid has a guardian vibe, or are the producer class also making kids? And then if so, how do they switch?
Yeah, well, this comes down again to this, how do you know this one person, one job thing?
Yeah.
And how do you know when something is a something? Like, how do you know, like, how can you get this kind of rigid, pure essentialism about anything, right? So, and that's where the forms, that's where always Plato will be critiqued for the forms and for some type of idea of a formal essence that holds, that gives a thing its nature. Because I think the places where this text shines is when it's undermining that idea, is when it's actually exposing the relativity of values and how we're going to have to come to agreement about our relative values and which ones are worth retaining and how we need to change, you know, that all of this stuff and talk about categories, where this is, and that would be the work of loving wisdom, would be to constantly update these categories and to have these conversations, because, you know, this text is full of paradox. This text is full of aporia. It is a truly, and that might be like one of the rhetorical or literary flourishes of the dialogue form. Because it can stay open that way, because there's all these different interlocutors. And Socrates isn't always, you know, he's not always saying what is right. He's like, he's doing philosophy. And doing philosophy doesn't mean getting things right all the time. If you love truth, then you're trying to like figure out what are the better categories. And I mean, I can't imagine, I can't imagine a philosophical. Anyway, I would, that's confusing, but I listened to this podcast, Sean Carroll, Mindscape, one of his recent guests is a political theorist. And she had some really interesting things to say. And at the end of the podcast, she says in this very platonic gesture, she's like, her gesture towards our experiment of democracy is like, she's like, we might need to imagine other forms. You know, we're so set, everybody's all up in arms about this end of democracy, end of democratic values. But we do need to think seriously whether this form that this especially like republic democracy that we have established is the best form. I mean, it's a radical thing to say because so many people, you know, just buy into the way to democratic ideals in a certain way without even knowing like what those are and who those are serving, and to think about the stickiness and trickiness of bureaucracy, and I mean what it would take to change the structures. You know, especially people who are really critical of capitalism. I mean, you have to do a lot of work to think about like how you would order dispersing resources otherwise.
And to like question if it's the best system sort of requires first aligning on what the definition of best or good is.
Right. So
what are you optimizing for?
Yeah.
Also what we're capable of, you know, like, you know, I think that so much of the time I personally will fall into this like naive assumption about what humans are capable of. And it's like, oh yeah, like we could just, you know, share and just chill out and drink wine and eat bread. Like, why not?
Somebody's got to make the wine and make the bread, and grow the wheat and grow the grapes and own the land on which the wheat is grown. And
does someone need to own it? Yeah.
Well, the land has to be there and it has to be worked, and there has to be an
Yeah.
agreement about who's going to take care of which part of the land so that the grapes, we know a lot more about viniculture now, that like it doesn't have to be this highly ordered, I don't know how much you guys study about wine and wine production, but a lot of the avant-garde winemakers in the old world, Italy and France, some people never stopped producing this wine this way, where the grapes were near all this other shrubbery, and they weren't like, I'm from California, from wine country, and you see the same and I hate California wines, and you see the same manicured hillsides, just rows of grapes, rows, and your idea of viniculture is that like that's what viniculture looks like, just rows of perfectly symmetrical grape vines. And then I waited tables and studied enoculture and enology, and the move towards organic and like bio. So some of the old world, like some of the stuff in Burgundy it gets its interesting flavors from being near all of these other different bushes and plants and things like that, and not having, maybe some of the grape orchards like do have some kind of symmetry to the way that they're planted, but not now. They're going in all crazy directions of having it a little bit more wild. But there are all these different techniques for pruning and prevent and having the wine be like, wine is such a great metaphor, because it's like you want it to be developed enough that it's not like too like abrasive and acidic, but you don't want it to be like overly coddled. Like it needs to have this appropriate amount of toughness, and then it has to have like good friends around it in terms of like the other shrubs and things that grow around it that are going to enhance its flavor and also help prevent the different diseases that wine is susceptible to. And then you have the people who are like just pruning, and they know that to just prune in this one way or to plant on this one hillside by sometimes generationally having this wisdom passed down through generations that is conserved. And then you might have one radical be like, I know we've been doing it this way this whole time, but I think if we plant on that hillside, we're going to get something completely different, and it's not going to be bad, but it's going to be different. It's just going to be different, and it's going to be cool in a different. So you have to let in some newness, some novelty sometimes. So it's always balancing these conservative principles with the ones with novelty, right? And finding that chemistry between conservatism and novelty that produces like really good grapes or really good citizens, and having like enough hard things to do, and then not being so hard that they end up not happy, right? Because that's a big issue too with the guardian class, and you're making these ascetics that are going to be miserable. Like it's miserable to have this diet, and for them to be working out this much, and to be guarding them, be so vigilant with their Fitbits. All the guardians wear Fitbits. But yeah, also to what extent this whole thing too of ownership, the concept of ownership and what that does to a society, and the feeling that like something is yours versus something is for everyone, is like just such a huge psychological shift in a political order, right? And the only kinds of like our political imaginations are pretty bridled by the experiment of communism in Soviet Russia and the Chinese brand, that we so far have this like association of a kind of freedom with capitalism, but like most of us know that like we're not totally free under capitalism. yeah, this part is very, everybody, all the theorists everywhere are thinking about these very problems still. Of how to do, like what level of education does every citizen need to have for a kind of communist anarchy to work? And this always makes us think of the surfing concept, right? Because in the water, there is this kind of self-regulating anarchistic environment that doesn't work that well all of the time, and sometimes works better than others, and is not perfect or pure or even ideal a lot of the time, because all of these problems, the psychological problems that come into play in any political system or any politics are at play there too, which is a person's capacity to self-deceive and to think that they have the true belief, and that they're the one operating with the true belief, so that they're the one who has the aletheia, the essential truth, and they self-appoint themselves the guardian of the essential truth. And then you have to ask, where does that authority come from? And that's really tricky.
How small their board is.
Yeah. How small? Well, it's just different in every place of the world. I mean, I've written about this. I mean, this is what that piece I wrote in Emotion. There's some chapters in my dissertation that are about this, but like the grapes, it's a highly local phenomenon. It really, whatever the surfing order looks like at any given breaks, has so much to do with how you access the break, what the socioeconomics are of the place that is close to the break, and how those are reflected in the water. The stuff that we started the conversation with about the coastal engineering, actually the space, for example, we could talk about the difference between Long Beach and Rockaway, and based upon the space between the jetties alone. So you have wider space between jetties, you have more space for people to spread out. You have less space between big rock structures, there's less space for people to spread out. Point breaks, reef breaks, takeoff zones that are smaller than other takeoff zones, versus a place where a person, like a point break, some point breaks, you can only take off at the one spot and then you ride the whole wave. Maybe you hope that the person can fall, but then there are others that section off, and those provide more opportunities for people to pick up waves in different places. The variables are kind of infinite. It's crazy that go into being a factor in how well or how ideal or not ideal the lineup functions. And then it's day to day with how people read the surf forecast. For example, yesterday morning, Monica and me and this kid Taji, we surfed a very crowded break in Rockaway alone for an hour, and we were all looking around, where is everybody? When is this going to happen? When is and actually it never really got that crowded all day, which is crazy, especially after a day like Sunday happened. With the waves were good on Sunday, but I think maybe yesterday was a lot better than Sunday. And it's just one of those things that
Sorry.
No. I was just thinking Monica and I knew it would be okay to surf, or we were going to go check it. But the three people who were out in the water who managed, and Taji is in outer space. He's always so high all the time. But he just lived down the street from the break. So he was just checking the surf and went surfing just because he lived there, not because he had any special knowledge, just because he was there. So I don't know where I was going with that. It's just that there are all different kinds of factors that make the situation more and less ideal and work well, when there is a higher level of education amongst and people share norms, it does work better.
But
Across
on that norm sharing point, I do think the one thing that he brings up that I was like, yeah, it would be cool if we had more of a sense of like a collective like possession or like a sense of like, I
Yeah.
mean, I think people bring that up all the time in like community where it's like if people feel like this is ours, but then I can see how that notion is also plays into localism where you I guess I can understand, and I obviously am not as well versed in all this, but like if you do feel a sense of ownership over a break or like or in a sense of wanting to take care of the place, I can see the frustration in dealing with people who don't feel that same sense of ownership over it, and that's
It
where
like increases the sense of othering with people from elsewhere. Like in the cities they're building, they're like, we all share, but like people from other cities, it's absolutely not yours.
I mean, they have to go to war.
Yeah.
Like the children have to ride.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you know, one of the retorts is you're gonna have little kids like engage in war games. That could be dangerous for the whole society.
It's so
if the parents and the
yeah.
children die.
It's so funny when they're like, just in case we're defeated, they'll ride away. All the children will ride away.
But it's also not wrong in the sense that, like, if this is a question about reality, right? And sheltering your kids from the harsh truth of reality versus giving them tastes of what it's really like and what they're going to prepare for. It's not like a terrible child rearing principle. You know, of like the kids need to know like these people are going to become the next class of guardians, although we are bracketing this the way that this goes against the myth of the metals. Because in the myth of the metals, yeah, any class, like anybody, any pair of human beings could make a kid that would be good for the guardian class. And the guardians can make bronze kids. There's nothing that's going to guarantee that through your breeding program. I mean, although here they do seem to say that like, oh, some kind of eugenics, if we did some kind of eugenics, you're going to get more often gold making gold, bronze making bronze, and silver making silver. If you are paying that much, like if you're stock breeding human beings, like you do dogs and horses and hairless cats.
There's like a better coefficient between two golds than there is between two bronzes, that it's like not a certainty.
Right. And then we have to remember too, that his gold class is not the kind of aristocracy. This is not like a blood nobility in the same way that he's saying that way is bad. Like if the kids don't start presenting an ability to have a quasi-ascetic lifestyle, he's not talking about like a leisure class that just sits on their ass.
like not Hollywood, like
no.
legacy.
It sounds like most pleasant to be a producer, to be honest. Like just like live your life, make pizzas or whatever, and then like go have dinner with your family and like go for long walks.
But that's not his argument, though. His argument is that the most pleasant life is to be the guardian class.
No, it seems very controlled.
And that the control is like where the joy and the flourishing come from, because like once they get their habits to this place where it's automatic and the guarding doesn't feel like guarding anymore because it's kind of like an automatic thing, that they're so homeostatic and so self-regulating that like, and that's kind of his principle too, is that you're like fine-tuning this racial program. And by race, I mean tribal, this tribal program where you have like, that's also a thing that is like being worked out or unclear throughout the dialogue, is to what extent is there really a distinction between classes? Is the point of having this guardian class as exemplars so that everybody wants to be the guardian class, so that everybody is a guardian of themselves, each one knows themselves and guards that self-knowledge of what kind of lifestyle is most conducive to real homeostasis and real flourishing, right? Which is where this book goes towards in this idea of philosopher. You would need a society ruled by philosopher kings, which actually it's in the verbal, it's the hoi philosophoi basileosin. So the philosophers will, it's actually first they're philosophers, and they will have to take on the practice of not, it's interesting, the word too, basileosin, it's not archontes. So it's not, and it's not despotes. So it's neither of the other words that are being used for ruler throughout the text thus far. So when he's talking about the political order of philosopher kings, this word basileus, it's where the name Basil comes from, or Basil, if you're really English. Yeah, it's being a king, which I think like is supposed to have like more of a sense of benevolence than a ruler, than an archonte, than an archon, and certainly more than a despote, because that's clearly always associated with fascistic leadership, autocratic leadership is the despot.
And if this were a play, that would be the top, this would be the place where everybody in the audience bursts out laughing, because that's the most absurd thing that Socrates has suggested yet, that the philosophers would be king.
Right. If it were a play, which it is. Yeah, totally.
I missed the book 4 discussion, but are the parts of the soul, because I think it's like the guardian has like the logical part of the soul dominates, and like there's that whole thing. Are those supposed to correlate with the metals? Like being that way means you're gold, or are these like two different things that intersect in like determining who's where?
So the tripartition of the soul,
yeah,
the intellective,
yeah,
spirited,
and
actually Roger brought up the thumos, and what his mentor Benedetti was always talking about thumos, and it's really book 4 where the thumos is everywhere. So it was like kind of premature when you were bringing it up in book 3, which is there, but like book 4 is like thumos. It's like the whole discussion is about thumos, and etymologically, the way we spell that is, you could say thymos. Everybody learned Greek differently. Those who learned ancient Greek learned it differently. I pronounced the upsilon as u, but it gets written as a y now. And there was a linguistic convention they call yodicization, where the long e's, so the sound a from eta, and the sound u from upsilon all got turned into e. So like when you hear Greek being spoke, you hear a lot of, like modern Greek, a lot of e. So for example, the prefix hyper is hyper, hyper, right? So sometimes I will pronounce a word. So like thumos is written th, it's written theta, upsilon, mu, omicron, sigma. So thumos or thymos, themos, right? So a modern Greek speaker would pronounce, when they see the word, they would say themos. And that's where we get the, what is it? Thyroid. Sorry. Yeah. So the thyroid is the gland that regulates your hormones. And horme is another word for like anger. Or it's related to spirit and everything. So the hypothalamic system, like the all of this regulatory system. So now speaking medically of the parts of the body in the tripartition of the soul. So the lower part is the epithumia. That's the desiderative part, or the so-called desiderative part. That's the processing place, the sex, the genitals and food place, the stomach, the liver, and the genitalia. And then, you know, so it is a vertical hierarchy of like intellective, spirited, and then desiderative below. And the heart, the pride, like it gets hurt in a different way than like the appetite does. The appetite's like, I'm just hungry, or I'm just horny and I just want to do this stuff. And the spirited part is like, that was so wrong, I'm gonna get that guy, fuck that guy, you know. And the intellective parts, obviously, when it's working well, doesn't let those ones be like, yeah, that's what we're gonna do. Let's eat all that stuff. Let's fuck all that stuff. Let's fucking get that guy. But the part in the tripartition of the soul, the part that's like, we're gonna get that guy, is not the part that's, I'm gonna eat all that stuff. So he sees those as different, but he sees the intellective part as regulating both of them. It's like, come on, guys, let's talk. Is it gonna really be in your benefit if you eat all that stuff and fuck all that stuff and get that guy right now? Is it gonna be in our overall benefit as like one system that has to work together for these things? So yeah, the gold would be the intellective, I guess, in a way. So like they roughly correspond, because he's so into like humans. Let's not say Plato or Socrates. Humans are into these kinds of categorizations. There's a reason why, if you're trying to like make a lot of money on the internet these days with writing things, you write listicles. 5 main mistakes. Like, people love these easy ways of categorizing things. We have done for like quite some time. So it makes sense that like they would roughly correspond, because those kind of paradigms are, you know, I would say it's a weakness of ours to go towards those kinds of categories, actually, unless we're always building nuance in them. You know, so the tripartition was supposed to be a nuance on the previous rational, irrational, and then Aristotle's going to come around and be like, no tripartition, just rational and irrational. And he sees benefits to that. So I do think, yes, roughly,
Yeah,
they would correspond, but we could get into like debates about that though.
yeah.
We were
Yeah,
talking
I was just thinking about the idea
about whether
that
they
there's
corresponded to the id, the ego, and the superego, which was a really interesting discussion, which they don't quite correspond, because the Freudian framework works a lot differently.
I was also just like thinking about Maslow's hierarchy and like the, you know, your just essential needs being met, which is like sort of the appetite first. And
all of this is about the regulate, like this
Yeah.
whole project is about how you regulate desire.
yeah,
The whole kind of project of being a human being is understanding our drives and our desires and our needs, and like where one thing stops and the other one starts. That's always like my big thing with surfing and with waves and stuff, and sharing resources, is, and this attitude of abundance versus scarcity, you know, where I'm like really pushing hard on in the newsletters and a lot of what I've been thinking about, because it's been therapeutic for me too. Just when somebody gets in my way, or somebody burns me, or does any kind of thing where like I can't get the wave, and I just think about, well, you got plenty of waves already, and there's going to be more waves to come. That just in changing that, you know, using my intellective part to reason myself out of the bad attitude is helpful, right? And to actually look at the situation differently, and like think about also, what would getting that wave have done for you? Like, how is my desire constituted that it needed that thing, or it perceived that it needed that thing? Where when I can rationally reflect that, as long as I have in a longer span of time, get to ride some waves and get opportunities to get better at riding waves. You know, because I get so much video, it's like I only need one or two good ones, and I get the video. I get to watch the wave over and over and over and over again. So it kind of exponentially, and then I get to learn from the mistakes by watching the video as well. So, and I can surf without video too, because I've seen enough video also. You know, so it's about like, when do I need this? Why do I need this? Do I need that extra? Why do I want the chocolate right now? Like, where's the need coming from? Right. And to really be a philosopher, everybody could practice philosophy in that way just by analyzing your desires. And a lot of the any political project is managing human resources and desires and perception of abundance and scarcity. And there are people there is real scarcity, you know, based upon access and historical positioning to resources, for sure. But even then, there can be a kind of leveling down across all classes of society, where it's not a myth of metals, but it's like some people, regardless of the class structure they come from, really get into contemplating their drives and their desires. And that does set you up to flourish better, because then you're not reacting. And you're not assuming that like a thing is yours just because like you're just making that assumption. You know, like, for example, when people get really pissed off in the lineup when you like burn them accidentally, and say it worked out okay, not like the accident, you burn them, it was bad, but they just won't let it go, right? They can't get to a reflective place where they can see a bigger picture about what that wave, where it fits into the whole entire thing in their life. And they want some kind of retributive justice. They feel something has been taken away from them irrevocably, in a way that like somehow yelling at a person or screaming at a person is somehow going to like restore balance for them.
I feel like they must feel out of control in some other part of their life.
Yeah. Or yeah, I mean, they must. Yeah. I mean, I would buy that too. Yeah. I know it is funny. Like nobody that I coach is like that kind of person. That kind of person wouldn't get coaching.
Yeah. I also feel like, granted, I'm not surfing when like the waves are like epic or whatever, but like the majority of time I've done something like that accidentally, I've paddled back out and been like, oh, I'm so sorry, whatever. I usually make a friend. Like people are so nice and chill about it, and then like those become like your friends in the lineup. Like I feel like most people are like, it's not that big of a deal if it's not a pattern that you're like consistently doing. I just feel like when someone is like, yeah, I don't know, unable to like regulate their reaction to that situation, there's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
They must be stressed.
Yeah, I just think on a large like political scale, like you have a lot of people assuming that things are a certain way and that this is justice and this equals like, yeah, this is the right, like this is the right amount of retribution, like this is the right amount of symbolic punishment in order for a kind of order to be restored, without actually doing the philosophical work of trying to get at what the categories are that they're trying to balance out. Like what was the actual wrong that was done? Who was taken away from? What were the conditions under which the thing was taken away, privated? And where were the motivations for those actors to take that thing away? And yeah, there just could be more diplomacy, like within, to use the body city analogy, like within individual bodies and larger political bodies as well. There could be more diplomacy and more discourse, the more that people are reflecting about the source of their desires and how we're constituted in such a way as these desiring beings. And then, you know, this now larger conversation is about how capitalism, the larger conversation amongst theorists today is about how capitalism organizes that desire for you, right? This is like all the Deleuze and Guattari stuff. The bodies without organs is how how there are forces larger than you organizing your desire. So then you have to reflect about like which of your desires is like proper to you, whether it is ever proper to you at all, and which are those that have some type of co-creation by like larger external forces.
Noelle, you're like eye roll.
Sorry, I was just like all there's, but that's fine.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Like, how could any of them not be partially co-creative?
Yeah, I mean that was what Dennett was about too, was that like the memes are the things that like basically create our consciousness. So our very consciousness is created by these external linguistic entities that like viruses want to replicate and get themselves at they don't even, it's just like, it's like evolution, like they don't actually have an essential purpose other than to keep replicating. And so they find hosts, and the more that they replicate, the stronger that becomes a reality of this is just how it is, because the meme evolved the culture in that way. Like once the word got said, some stuck more than other ones, and those are the ones that evolved our consciousness, like from the outside in and then inside out. It's very, that book is really good. The Dennett is really good. I mean, I think I buy a lot about the memetics too, because I mean, what, like if we look at this text too as like a playful meme scene, you know, the Guardian class is supposed to be like this, like Socrates is playing around with like this new mimetic structure, you know, and he's like, well, these other, you know, if we can imagine this one, then like, and the other ones have come into being, like, why not this one? We could, if we can imagine it, this can also come into being. And it has in sci-fi, like the book that I can think of that has the society most like this Guardian class actually is not Dune, but is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
They're not even in the planet Anares, where Shevek is. They don't even call the body parts my hand. It's just the hand.
Yeah. Yeah, and they really do share everything.
They really do. And you don't know who the parents are.
Yeah. I totally forgot about that book.
Yeah.
I was thinking a lot of Brave New World.
I keep thinking of Brave New World throughout this. Yeah. Because they're like trying to pretend like it's good and it's bad.
Yeah, I mean,
super subjective comment, but
it's also pointing towards that. It's also pointing to that fact of just the way that the family structure is such a strong structure throughout like human history, of even in the sense of like blood lineage and ownership. My dad, my mom, my brother, like this is our clan, and the way that like families create their own units against which they are ordered differently than other families, you know, and there are alliances among different tribes of human beings. But essentially what this kind of communist order does is try to chip away at like the human drive towards tribalism, even though it's just extending the tribalism to like a larger family, right? So it's taking that essential tribal logic and just making it bigger, like outside of the core group of the family, but still within the, like in the confines of this concept of a city state that would be at war with other tribes. Like it does not imagine, I think that's the part that I keep coming back to too, is that like this text never imagines a world where there is not warfare. That is not part of the thought experiment here.
Yeah.
Another world is not possible.
Well, because they could have done it at the scope of the world, but they're like, no, we're doing it at the scope of a city in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't like their imagination of what the world is really different from ours.
Yeah.
I mean, we like have satellites and shit. We have the internet. Like they thought of Greeks and barbarians.
Yeah.
So they definitely had a different, they definitely had a really working with some different science about what the world is.
Different priors.
They had different priors. They definitely had different priors. Yeah, I didn't.
Emma, what parts were feeling like Brave New Worldy to you?
I mean, all the just, you know, the like eugenics stuff, not, you know, making sure, you know, it's the idea that children are born separated from their parents and intentionally obscuring that relationship. I think, I mean, it's been a long time since I read Brave New World, but I think that was kind of the setup. Like there were like nurseries of children, something like that. It just felt like a dramatization of that sort of setup.
It's been a long time for me too, but I always just like remember Soma, and they were like just chemically trying to like make people happy and fall in line.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most disturbing part of book 5 for me was this thing about how the breeding program needs to be hidden from the majority.
Yeah, with the lots and yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just that sort of like, we have the truth and that, you know, ends justify the means, like that sort of stuff is just like very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, also like in Dune, the Bene Gesserits, like love is dangerous to their breeding program. So any kind of like intense coupling where any two pairs fall in love with each other, that totally destroys, like love destroys the coherence of this communistic order. And so, and that's also the love between the parents and children too would destroy this order as well, because you couldn't love the whole group the same way that you love that one person or those few people who are a part of your smaller tribal unit. You could still have like a love for a larger principle, like for your community, for your state, or for your polis. But in this radical sense of communism, that kind of love, especially romantic love, is going to be a threat to the political order. And that's like a theme that we see with love throughout all of literature and human history, is that like the great Ian Curtis always says, love will tear us apart again. Like love is not just a force of synthesis. This is like one of the worst romantic myths about love, but that love is a force of synthesis and diaresis. It tears as much as it brings together.
Mm.
And so it's interesting to think about like requisite synthesis and requisite diaresis or ripping apart in order for a system to be healthy at all. Like how much ripping apart can it handle and is good for it, because some is good, and how much synthesis, can even be tolerated, because it's like Freud will later theorize and beyond the pleasure principle, is that we desire tension increase as much as we desire tension release or tension satisfaction. So like, in an obvious way, like there's no tension to be satisfied if the tension does not get raised. And something like so perfect where people just like, even the idea of people just like utilitarian, like procreating in a utilitarian manner just seems like actually counter to human nature. It doesn't seem like, I know, like maybe it isn't, maybe there are some forms of procreation that are that could be more utilitarian, but it always comes, there's lots of emotions in, like, I think also for women, like having to like grow babies in their body and develop that bond with that creature, and there's a lot to be said there, right? Because there are all different kinds of ways now that we have for that to happen. And there are things like surrogates and stuff, and all this stuff comes up in those situations as well, about the emotions that the woman forms with the child. And when they're talking about like building a society, like again, like back to this issue of like procreation and children and stuff, like this is always going, this has been controlling sex is a big part of politics. I mean, on a really basic point, controlling sex is a big part of politics, and controlling procreation is a big part of politics, and it continues to be a big part of politics.
Yeah, we saw that this year.
We see it every year so far. I've only been alive for 42 years and politically conscious for probably, I don't know, let's say since 1988. But since 1988, in my brain, I have friends who are my age who in 1986 were like being taken on pro-life rallies with their parents, where like I have a friend named Josh who like was a little kid holding up a picture of a baby fetus when he was 6. Now obviously doesn't have those politics at all, but he was used for the pro-life army as this cute little soldier, before he could even develop his own thoughts on the matter. So yeah, in my life so far, this whole thing with like controlling sex has been a big part, in just in American politics, but it is everywhere. I mean, a lot of what people believe is right has to do with this question that they're getting at here, which is sexual difference. A lot of what constitutes the truth for people, what constitutes a sense of reality, is sexual difference, which is why that continues to be such a hot topic. Bye, Fialka. Because people really feel that if you don't have like clear guidelines for what is for what sexes are, then the whole society comes undone. And on the other side, people are like, you don't need, that is not necessary for society to function. So
yeah, I think there's like this, there's like a category of sex and gender, and then there's like, we can't even conceive of something outside of the marital unit either. Like we can't conceive of, and that includes like everybody from like unmarried long-term like partners to like people raising I mean, I know it's like more common, but it's still like the foundation of I still, and maybe like I would still say even with like gay marriage or whatever, it's still like the heterosexual marriage is still like the foundation of like the order.
Right. They still want to be married and have that same union. It's not something other than that.
No, yeah,
It's to get the thing that the other people always already had, basically the socioeconomic benefits of the union of saying you're tied in this way, which is still based upon women as property,
right,
whether you're a man and a man or a woman and a woman.
right, right. And I mean,
And about inheritance things and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So super. Yeah. One of the things I was noticing is that, like, because I couldn't remember the order of the books because it has been a while. And book 4 ends with the ways to rule the soul is kind of the ways that you can, so your soul can be ruled democratically, autocratically, oligarchically. So it would seem that book 5 was going to start to be into the conversation of the different kinds of governments, but instead it's not about that at all. And actually it goes in this really weird way where we're supposed to hear about like bad ways of ruling things, and then it gets into sexual, then it's like, no, let's like talk more about the education system class again. And then it goes into this like crazy detour at the end. Well, clearly we're going to need philosopher kings.
right.
So we'll see what comes with book 6. I forget the order. But I also think it's an interesting thing to say that that different souls can be ruled according to these, like, so each human being can be like a more or less for themselves democratic, more or less autocratic, more or less oligarchic, more or less aristocratic way of just like ordering yourself. That's an interesting thought too, that I don't know. Little democracy cells being like, let's all take a vote on whether we have tofu for dinner tonight or something else. Anyway. All right. Well, that was fun again. And yeah, Thursdays have been working for me. That'll probably shift when Sophia's semester ends, but I always do these when she's not home, because otherwise I'm socializing with her.
My husband has started to try and schedule his weekly trivia games when I have book club.
Oh, that's cool.
So the shift is rippling.
I just have band practice until like around 7:45. So it's okay if I just like log on.
Late's fine. I mean, again, I might switch. The semester should end soon. I mean, obviously we're not going to have it next Thursday.
Right. I was like, what?
Maybe we'll have it on Monday though, since it's flat. So for me, also a lot of things are about flat and not flat.
Okay.
All right. That was awesome.
Thanks.